Hello, very beautiful community. You, if you're especially geeky, more geeky than you actually should be, would know that there are rumors on Z Telegram channels about a second wave of mobilization in Russia. What we're going to do in this video is look at the sources and assess whether this is substantial or whether it's baloney. Now, keep two things in mind. These are sources that have a vested interest in dragging Russia and Russian society deeper into the war. One. Two, they may be engaged in either spontaneous ventilation or in an orchestrated campaign to falsely exaggerate the prospect of a second wave of mobilization so as to get people to volunteer now. Let's read. I'm going to kick off with channeled medical kerfuffle about this inside the T. If by December the Ukrainian defense does not collapse, the general staff will have to make an unpopular decision: either halt the offensive or begin a new wave of mobilization. According to information from various sources within the military, the general staff carried out a full assessment of the situation and reached a harsh conclusion. The key indicator is breaking through the front line in the Donbass to a depth of 50 kilometers. If this cannot be achieved in the coming months, further offensive operations without a large-scale increase in manpower will prove impossible. The situation at the front is extremely difficult. The enemy has saturated the forward line with small FPV drones, which effectively block the possibility of classic assault attacks. Tank columns are long gone, battalion-level breakthroughs are impossible, and the tactic of advancing in small groups requires enormous effort and yields very little. The contract recruitment drive that was relied on a year ago no longer provides real growth in manpower, it merely covers the current losses. At the general staff, there have been repeated calls to bleed the rear of the Ukrainian forces and strike logistics and energy. But missile strikes remain targeted and do not disable infrastructure on a scale that could shift the balance. Ukraine continues to receive supplies, draw in reserves, and retain the ability to conduct prolonged defense. Thus, the military command's choice comes down to two scenarios. First, to try to maintain offensive momentum with small forces, but this essentially turns the operation into positional warfare. Second, mobilization, which could provide reserves, but would lead to political and social costs in the country. According to the General Staff assessment, a decision will need to be made by late November, December. If no breakthrough occurs, mobilization will become the inevitable plan B for further offensive action. Otherwise, they must agree to a truce or continue a trench war with no progress. Now, we're reading this together. Let me tell you straight away that I don't buy this. I'm suspicious. There's no reason in my assessment to expect a mobilization soon. That doesn't mean it can't happen. But let's make a remark about one passage here of a politically philosophical kind about the contract recruitment drive drying out to some degree. It's just an opportunity for me to say that it is wrong when we tend to describe Russian contract soldiers as folks who engage in a very transactional relationship with the Russian state. What they're doing is, in fact, engaging in a very deeply ideological relationship. So let's mention this briefly. Imagine that you have no responsibilities toward your state. Imagine that your state has no responsibilities toward you, according to how you feel about it. And imagine that you think that all your dealings with the state are a kind of business transaction, and even the question of your life is reducible to being a business transaction. That is an extremely ideological position in a mode of a kind of hyper-neoliberalism that's gone from neoliberalism, putting primacy on the market in a magical way, to actually saying, well, now we're normalizing any conflict because might is right isn't just how the world works, it is the legitimate way for things to go on. So this is a profoundly and fanatically ideological dynamic. One of the consequences it has in practice, this is another footnote, is that it's very hard for loss of life in the Russian military among contract soldiers to generate resentment, because families, loved ones, villages, communities feel that Ivan just did a business deal which could have worked out well for him, but worked out badly. And if what Ivan is doing is a business deal, then it's not my business what business deal he does. So this is not a matter of my country sending a fellow citizen to engage in appalling action with appalling consequences for himself and others. It's a business deal between one actor and another, neither of which sort of impress me as having that much to do with the way I go on with my life. So let them do it. And if it goes wrong for them, it's gone wrong for them. What have I got to do with it? Now, the wonderfully balanced Russian commentator Dmitry Kolesev is one of the folks who did a video on this, and he then went on to quote some smaller channels reacting to this big post. So we're going to do the same. We've got philologists in ambush. The point is the situation at the front is indeed difficult, and the chronic shortage of combat personnel and infantry units remains acute. The range of decisions described in the article really does have a place. The article is the Insider T post above. The prospects are hardly reassuring. In some cases, these masses will be run through the grinder to the point of mental breakdown and physical overload, ending up unfit for duty with damaged spines, backs, knees. In other cases, the masses will languish in idleness, killing time with pointless distractions like binging on booze. In addition, it also makes sense to ask whether these hypothetical reinforcements will only be absorbed into existing units, or whether they'll also be used to form entirely new formations. In the second case, given the overall shortage of equipment and competent officers, it's almost certain we'd get weak light infantry formations with questionable prospects. But in the first case, the situation may be even worse, since a huge portion of reinforcements would end up under commanders who already practice the crude method of conducting combat operations with meat assaults. In general, there are many questions, and the answers so far look far from favorable. And judging by everything, we are not even talking about rotations for people who are already working beyond the limits of physical and moral exhaustion. Now, a smaller account, Donetsk infantry. I have warned you, this will not be as the rear-dwelling softies imagine. Everyone who didn't show up on their own in time to get into normal units with normal guys will be sent to all kinds of places haphazardly. To Puziks. Puzik is a commander who, out of a personal vendetta, sent subordinates into certain death. Shoved into meat assaults with Mosin rifles, outdated inadequate equipment, or handed shovels and hazmat suits to dig graves. Sledgehammer. A big war will leave no one aside. I'm not calling on them right now to drop everything and go to the front into the meat assaults. I won't be the one summoning. If I'm not mistaken, very soon the motherland will summon them through mobilization. And if right now they can choose a normal unit and decent commanders, later they'll be sent anywhere to whoever. So let's react. Now, I can't assess whether what the last two smaller channels are saying is spontaneous ventilation, or whether it's the kind of propaganda campaign that says volunteer now, otherwise you'll be forced to do this on much worse terms later. But what do I overall think about this? The prospect of a mobilization being something that the regime is forced into soon. Well, certainly. We have got Putin expending an enormous amount of money on contract soldiers, on payments to the dead and wounded. Now, the latest estimates put this into the sort of 30 plus billion a year. I'm not an expert on these numbers, but $1 billion. We've also got a very large percentage of GDP annually being expended on a rate of progress, if it is there at all, which is so small at the front that is literally invisible if you look at the map of Ukraine from above in a vantage point where you can capture the country as a whole. The Russians are making incredibly small progress. But that does not persuade me that a mobilization is something we should expect soon. Of course, we've got to understand that the edict mobilization edict from 2022 is still active, so it doesn't need to be redone. If there were a wave of mobilization, it would indeed be far more effectively organized with much more effective coercion than what we had in 2022. But Putin is enormously personally skeptical of a visible, major, sort of non-hybrid wave of mobilization where everybody sees what's happening and then has an opportunity to react. Putin is obsessed with opinion polls. Opinion polls have a political function in Russia. They are meant to legitimate the ruler's monarchist authority. And that's why we should be skeptical about engaging them unless we are prepared to interpret them very well. But the point of polls is to generate a prop of legitimacy for Putin, whereby he can say to people in his inner circle, don't challenge me, the Russian people are behind me. Where he can say to any opposition or heterodoxy in the country, don't challenge me, the Russian people are behind me. And Putin is allergic to doing something that he thinks is going to generate resistance in the depoliticized blob and even resistance among some of his overt supporters. So he still feels very, very bad about what he did in autumn 2022, and he feels very bad about the prospect of doing it again. The most plausible scenario in which he would do it again, short of extreme need and desperation, is actually a scenario whereby there would be a political function to the mobilization and not just a military one. That's to say that Putin would need to be in a situation where he wishes to use a visible wave of mobilization as a way of politicizing, mobilizing, not in the military sense, Russian society. So he would be more inclined to do a wave of mobilization, an overt wave of mobilization, if he were trying to rebalance that balance that he always tries to strike between depoliticization and politicization among the Russian population. The trouble here is that Putin knows that politicizing the Russian population further is dangerous for him, that he's dependent on all kinds of structural ways on the population remaining depoliticized, satisfied with the confiscation of their public freedom because they've retained a degree of private freedom. I think people in Russia tend to underestimate how much the regime will come for their private freedom too. They tend to underestimate how many totalitarian turns are possible in the short to medium-term future. But Putin knows that it's a difficult thing to try to do. There are going to be deleterious consequences to trying to politicize the population. He also knows that it's not something that's entirely in his control. He could try politicization and it might just backfire. And Putin already feels, not backfiring by working but undermining his regime, but backfiring by the population just not responding to his efforts. And Putin already feels, despite his dependence on depoliticization, a kind of resentment, a kind of frustration at the Russian population. And he does look at them with a degree of derision because of this. And the frustration is that, well, I want them depoliticized, but can't they just be a little bit more enthusiastic than they are about my war in Ukraine, about my modes of foreign escalation? Why aren't they more enthusiastic? So now, of course, the logical choice here is that you can continue to focus on contract soldiers, on the modes of mobilization that are working now, without doing something that's radically different. But that means you're going to be losing money, losing funding in various kinds of social services, and people are going to feel that. People are going to be frustrated by that. You could also say that there's going to be frustration if there is an overt forced wave of mobilization, and people who are being taken know that they're not going to be rotated and so on, the way Putin will weigh this sort of dilemma will be purely based on regime stability and degree of rebellion he might get from the population. Final remark. Don't underestimate Putin's confidence about the non-military victories coming his way. Don't underestimate Putin's confidence in Ukraine's medium-term political collapse, in the West's medium-term democratic collapse. Because my analysis clearly says that Putin remains highly optimistic in these dimensions, perhaps delusionally so, I don't see the materials out there for a major second wave of mobilization, as opposed to perhaps trying to pick people up a bit more, but doing it in a hybrid way, doing it to a degree by stealth and so on. So the core message here, that Russia is imminently facing a second wave of mobilization, is a message that as things stand, although nothing is impossible, I don't have much reason to recommend you as one that's worth urgently engaging with or being persuaded by. So I have a fairly clear position on what we have come across. Lots of love, talk soon.